There are nearly 83 million people displaced around the world today. Refugees, internally displaced people or IDPs, asylum seekers, and more. Simply put, tens of millions of people are not where they were, not where they're going to be, and more young people are growing up in displaced settings. And world leaders don't seem fully prepared to confront the causes or the consequences of these extraordinary trends. In an effort to elevate our understanding and apply the tools that we have, the Wilson Center is really proud to present its latest issue of the award-winning Wilson Quarterly, an issue dedicated entirely to human displacement. It's entitled Humanity in Motion: Scenes from the Global Displacement Crisis. It features written contributions from Jordan's King Abdullah, Colombia's President Iván Duque, Henrietta Fore of UNICEF, David Beasley of the World Food Program, Congressman Henry Cuellar of Texas, and Mexican Senator Claudia Ruiz Massieu, and many others. Today we're going to preview some of the themes in this special edition with a short panel discussion. Today we have Hal Ferguson, a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center, former Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, and someone who lived and worked in Afghanistan and the Middle East, working on programs in democracy and democratic governance for the International Republican Institute. We also have Jonathan Majak, a Director of Grants Management at the Wilson Center, who was born and raised in South Sudan. One of the well-known lost boys of Sudan, he lived for 13 years in refugee camps in Ethiopia and Kenya before finally coming to the U.S. in 2001 as part of the Refugee Resettlement Program. And they're joined by Kaylee Ober, Senior Advocate and Program Manager for the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International. Kaylee has over a decade of experience on climate, migration, and displacement issues with organizations like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. She helped craft a special feature in the Wilson Quarterly that helps readers better visualize displacement and what it looks like and its fallout all around the world. I hope you enjoyed this panel discussion, and please make sure that you get to the Wilson Center website and read this special issue of the Wilson Quarterly. Kaylee, let me begin with you. So you contributed the digital experience to the Wilson Quarterly, and I have to tell you, it's gorgeous. So gorgeous footage, gorgeous images of rather harrowing experiences. What was it that you were trying to convey?
Well, first I should make it very clear that I actually wrote the text, and you know, of course that contributes to kind of the narrative and the framing and the feel to the piece, as well as the pictures and the videos. And it's really, you know, altogether makes a more interactive, holistic experience. And I think it's very important to have that experience so that you understand the humanity behind some of these numbers and some of these statistics, right? And I think that's what the piece is really trying to do.
Yeah, and I think also something else that I thought was especially notable about your piece is helping us to understand not only what displacement looks like, but what the drivers look like. I think a lot of people, when they think of displacement, they think of natural disasters, and as you point out in your work, it's also increasingly climate-forced migration. And we're seeing more and more of that, and some of that's captured in your piece as well.
Absolutely. In fact, my background, my expertise is in climate change and displacement specifically, so you probably can see that throughout the piece. What we found in this last year, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center specifically found that 3 times as many people are being displaced due to weather-related disaster, which is a proxy for climate change in certain respects, than conflict. So it is a huge driving force.
Yeah, and I would guess even on top of that, so where you do have migration driven by conflict, some of that conflict is actually due.
Absolutely, there's a huge overlap, and I think that's one of the challenges with really digging into the numbers sometimes. But as my colleague Andrew Harper at the UNHCR, who's a special advisor on climate change there, likes to say, 90% of those who are already refugees are in fragile, conflict-affected states that are also experiencing the highest rates of climate change impacts.
Well, and unfortunately, since we all know that these extreme climate conditions are increasing, not decreasing, what you're suggesting is that the numbers forced into migration are only going to go up.
I think so, and we haven't even really scratched the surface of slow onset events for example. So sea level rise, glacial melt, those things are quite disruptive and have knock-on effects. So we haven't seen, I think, the extent to which climate change really plays a role in displacement.
And so maybe, unfortunately, this is just the beginning of what could be a long-term challenge for all of us. So John Thon, your piece is entitled Behind the Numbers, Humans in the Warehouse. You were one of those numbers. So you were one of those humans. Tell us a little bit about your experience. First off, obviously, the years that you spent displaced, but then where it's brought to you to today.
Oftentimes, people talk about the numbers, and so what I want to capture in that story is to put the human face behind those statistics. You know, numbers are good. I work on statistic money, but
I should say you're a grants manager. You work with numbers every day.
So, but we need to humanize those numbers as far as forced displacement is concerned. So I spent 13 years in the refugee camp and displaced camp in Ethiopia and in Kenya. And in those 13 years, I have come to realize that the way we talk about forced displacement now, we are talking in a passive way. And so I want to bring the human dimension of forced displacement to the discourse. Human response to forced displacement is along a continuum. On one side of the spectrum is depression. On the other side is what is called the post-traumatic growth. And then in the middle is resilience. And so the narrative always focuses on the depression, the PTSD side of the forcibly displaced person. So, you know, we can talk about that, but also complete the continuum in discussing the narrative. And I want to approach the forced displacement from a resilience lane, or you know, a combination of resilience and human dimension. We focus on expanding refugee choice to life, choice to education, and those things that are often not brought up to the discussion. And so I am here as a success story of those numbers having come here through the goodwill of this country, and others who are success stories like me, I think want to focus on the human dimension.
Yeah, and I gotta say, what I found most striking about your contribution, and you wrote here, refugees are not just passive victims, we are models of resilience. And so, to me, the takeaway from your piece is that it shatters the stereotypes that I think Americans have. We look at people who are displaced and we see them only as victims and helpless and hopeless. And you're saying just the opposite, that oftentimes towers of resilience, and you have something to contribute. And of course, John Thon, in your case, you certainly have contributed. The United States of America is much, much better off for the contributions that you have made and that you're continuing to make. But refugees and IDPs are not merely numbers, and they're not merely victims.
Yes, we can learn something from their stories, from their narrative. And to me, speaking of resilience, I have 4 coping mechanisms that I use, and I think they apply to anybody, you know, but the story of refugees captured these 4. One is the cultural upbringing. We need to understand where the refugees were before they were forced to leave their homelands. And there is something to learn about that. I grew up in a pastoral society, so, you know, I was exposed to that way of life before the Exodus. Second, and the reason why cultural upbringing is very important is because it's at a frame of reference. So when you are facing all these adversities of forced displacement, you have something to refer to, what I call the mental toolbox. And my dad's word are always I unleash them when I face adversity. My dad told me at a very young age, be strong-willed, be courageous, never give up, and do not let anything weaken your heart. And so that's cultural upbringing. Second strategy for resilience is the religious faith. For me, faith in God kept me going. I was a Sunday school teacher, but in the church, you learn about the future, and that is something important. And then another factor is community network. And so when we were displaced, we banded together in a group of brothers and sisters and made our way out of the adversity. And then finally, resilience, you need something to cling to, something to replace what you left. And this time when we were in the refugee camp, it was the drive for education. And so I went to school for the first time in 1988 in Ethiopia, and I had to do my exam writing in the sand. There were no enough materials. And, in those refugee camps, the education I gained helped me cope with the life in the United States. And so these four resilient factors can apply to everybody. When you are facing adversity, you ask yourself, if this so-and-so can make it, why not me? And this is something we can learn from refugees.
So never tempted to give up?
Try and have something to reference to. Like when I was walking barefoot, I had my shoes that were tattered when I was walking, and then I had to walk barefoot, and I was tired and sit down on the roadside. But I recall my dad's word: "Do not let anything weaken your heart." And so I asked myself, if I remain here, who am I going to be? And my dad was a public figure. He was a tribal chief. And so I held myself to a standard that he expected of me, but also it helped me cope with those adversities. So yeah, try not to give up.
Hal, you tell also a very, very moving story. In 2012, you were in Afghanistan and you had to say goodbye to some good friends and colleagues in Afghanistan. Did you ever think that you would see them again?
No, I didn't. In 2012, the nonprofit I was with at the time, the International Republican Institute, was downsizing, and it was my responsibility to let some of our people go, our Afghan staff go. And at the time, I thought I'd never see them again. They were all very gracious, understanding. I had known them for many years, and it was a very sad time. But when I was saying goodbye, I thought this was going to be it, which was a much bigger tragedy, I thought. And then years later, here we are today, and the Taliban were marching on Kabul, and the IRI and other organizations within its family of NGOs helped organize an evacuation of many of their former staff, including some of the people who I had not seen since 2012. I was fortunate enough to be asked to help with their relocation, and I met them again in Tirana, Albania, where they were coming off the plane, guests of the Albanian government, to be housed there while awaiting visas to the United States. So it was a very moving, very personal experience for me to see them again and do what I could to help their transition.
And Albania has a particular history and a particular national attitude towards those who are displaced.
It was something that, to be honest, I didn't know until I got there. But the Albanian people are historically very generous towards refugees, towards people in need. A couple of anecdotes. The first, most recently, they were very generous to Kosovar refugees during the Kosovo War. But even prior to that, in World War II, the Albanians were occupied first by the Italians and then by the Germans. And of course, were subject to the Germans' attempts to exterminate the Jewish people. But the Albanians did a pretty good job of actually protecting their Jewish population as well as welcoming Jewish refugees from elsewhere. And they actually they ended World War II with more Jews than they had started with, thanks to this sort of national ethos of helping people in their times of need.
It's not the only experience that you've had in working with those who have been displaced. When you worked at USAID, you worked on those who had been forced to flee in northern Iraq, Yazidis and Christians and other ethnic minorities. And so you heard a lot of stories about those who've been victimized by the worst kinds of tyranny, repression, and violence that one can imagine.
Yeah, one of our top priorities when I was at USAID was trying to help these small, comparatively small communities recover from ISIS genocide. To one extent or another, they were all targeted for extermination by ISIS. It wasn't just the Yazidis, it was a number of different Christian denominations, ethnic minorities. All of them were cleansed from the Nineveh plans, from their historic homelands there. And we did what we could to try to rebuild their homes, their communities, try to encourage them back. And it wound up being a really important microcosm, I think, of this larger challenge of displacement, not only the reasons for it, but how difficult it can be to really get people comfortable in coming home when, among other things, they continue to be concerned about their own security. Because, of course, as the Yazidis will tell you, they've been subject to genocides over and over and over again throughout the course of history. And it can be very difficult to rebuild that base, that foundation of trust among a larger community in a nation to bring people home safely and in a dignified manner.
So we've just been talking about difficulties and challenges, and each of you, through your contribution and your stories, have helped us see the humanity behind the numbers. The numbers are sometimes overwhelming. Nearly 83 million displaced around the world. As I often say, look, tens and tens of millions of people are not where they were and not where they're going to be, and they're in motion. And Jonathan, as you point out in your piece, in just the last couple of years, we've had 1 million children born displaced, and very likely statistically to grow up displaced. So what do we do for those who are growing up displaced? How do we connect them to the world around them? And what do we do to help them to be contributors in society? So hopefully it's not 13 years and wandering through fields and going from country to country. What should we do?
I think it is in the best interest of every country and the world at large to have these children, to have their future charted for them instead of having their potential being wasted. I have relatives, friends that are still in the same refugee camp that I have lived, and that camp was established more than 20 years ago. So it is a generational challenge for displaced. It's a generational challenge. What we can do from the talking about humanity, this is where we can come together. Our values are tested at a time of crisis. And in a time of crisis, that we need to turn to one another, not against each other. And this time, I think giving them access to education while they are there, waiting for their return, which may never come. But if we invest in the education, they can produce success stories that can help resolve these issues. And so education is number one. Number two, self-sufficient, self-reliant initiatives in those camps and urban areas. But this is where we come to different in policies for host countries. In Kenya, for example, where I lived for almost 10 years, they don't have integration policy, where refugees are allowed to work and to be integrated. In Uganda, it's a little bit different. They allow refugees to be productive members of that society. So I think encouraging the host countries to integrate them into the society, they can become productive citizens and contribute to local economy and global economy as a result. Because by not doing anything to these people and having let them sit there for a long time, we are just wasting their potential. And it is a burden to the world at large.
And Kayla, you've done lots of work on displacement, the drivers, the fallout from displacement. So what do you see that we should do in terms of policies that we should adopt and perhaps tools that we can provide to deal with either side of the equation, to prevent or mitigate displacement or help those who are inevitably displaced in any case?
Yeah, in fact, I was part of a Refugees International task force looking at giving the Biden administration policy recommendations around climate change and displacement issues. And we found that there's two big buckets of work to be done. Like you noted, prevention is one and the other is protection. I think prevention is very simple, especially from the US side, which is mobilizing financing, right? And so that includes investing in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change, enabling people to stay in climate fragile environments, right? If they would like to do so, but then also acknowledging that migration or displacement may be an eventual reality for folks and planning accordingly for that with this protection phase of investment and intervention. And so we really call for a few things. One is enlarging and broadening existing pathways and also creating new pathways for folks to come to the United States, for example. So continuing the tradition of refugee resettlement that is so strong in the United States, and President Biden has already, acknowledged that the refugee cap must grow and more need to be resettled here, but also understanding that not everyone affected by climate change, for instance, that will be displaced will qualify as refugee, and figuring out progressive or novel ways to deal with that and enabling them to also move freely.
And I think one of the things that your contribution does very well is remind people that we're not just talking about refugees. We're talking about internally displaced, of course, asylum seekers as well, but not everyone fits that stereotype. You have internally displaced, and it's an increasing number, and that presents its own set of challenges.
Absolutely. I think by and large, the media or the public are very understanding or have knowledge about refugees. We've done a great job of really talking about kind of American standard of resettlement. But we haven't done as well of a job talking about IDPs, for instance, or migrants that might have irregular status or might be forced in some way. And we make a very binary distinction about who's deserving of this sort of prevention or intervention and protection. And I think with the climate change world and the pressing and changing 21st century problems that we have, we need to start reconceptualizing that a little bit.
Hal, let's get back to northern Iraq. And I think of the work that was done there, helping people to either resettle or rebuild communities, creating some kind of vibrancy where you have people who have been forcibly displaced for an extended period. What is it that they need to be able to go back and to rebuild some kind of future and some kind of opportunity?
Yeah, well, there's a whole suite of needs that people need, and you start with the fact that people want to go home, right? It's their home, and they've been there for generations, and there's a baseline of desire to go home, right? But there are a number of needs that they're going to need in order to do that safely. They're going to need security. They want to be reassured that the government, the Iraqi government in this case, will provide security for them, which incidentally became a real challenge in northern Iraq because there are Iranian-backed militias that are still occupying a lot of these communities as personal fiefs.
So some of the same people that forced them into motion in the first place are still hanging around.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, northern Iraq is a very politically and security complex place where a lot of the Iranian-backed militias were initially mobilized to fight ISIS, but they're not good guys, right? They've now taken over northern Iraq, and then added to that, you've got the PKK and other terrorist groups. It's very complex. Security is just the first one of their needs, though. They also need a roof over their head, they need jobs, they need health care, they need the entire functioning of the economy back. But I do keep going back to that security. If people don't trust that they're going to be safe when they go home, they're not going to go home. And that's the biggest challenge we still face in northern Iraq. And just in closing, I'd reiterate some of Jonathan's theme of permanence, right? I think one thing that Americans and others around the world don't fully appreciate about the refugee crisis globally is that there is a permanence to it. Once people get ejected from their homes, one way or another, they wind up putting down roots where they've moved. Either they're not comfortable going back for security reasons or others. And that creates a whole nother problem of integration, as Jonathan was saying, or other issues. So there's a whole suite of challenges of trying to get people comfortable in going home again.
In the Wilson Quarterly, we had a wide range of contributions. Some of the most hopeful contributions came from Henrietta Fore of UNICEF and David Beasley of the World Food Program. And I asked Henrietta if there was one thing that you would recommend, if there was one thing that we should do, what would it be? And she said, connect every displaced community to the internet. She said, create the opportunity for young people to get an education, but also to connect to the world around them. Jonathan, what kept you going when you were in Ethiopia, when you were in Kenya, eventually coming to the US? But how did you connect with the world around you? How did you know what was going on? How did you feel as though you could prepare yourself for the bright future which you, in fact, have?
What kept me are those resilient factors that I mentioned. You know, my cultural upbringing, the values and the words of my dad, my religious faith, and the drive for education, and the fact that I was in a network of people facing similar issue. But you know, we were disconnected from the world around us. A refugee camp is located in a rural part of any country, but the radio was our way of connecting with the world, especially the BBC. And so when, you know, we heard about something going on, it can be explained to us, or we sit around. If one person, mostly the teachers who taught us, has a radio to connect us to the outside world. The other way, I mean, from a personal experience, is that around the 1980s, 90s, I was in the refugee camp in Ethiopia, so American delegation went there. And it was a huge number of unaccompanied minors in that camp, so we were taught to recite, "Welcome, welcome, American congressmen." Now that stuck to my mind, but all of us didn't know what that means. American congressmen.
We should go find some of those congressmen.
Until I came here and realized, you know, when I worked for a member of Congress as an intern during my junior year, now I understand the power of American congressmen. But that was the time we connected to the outside world through the delegation visiting us. And you remember Ambassador Green, Mickey Leland of Texas was on a mission to visit the refugee camp, and that was the camp I was in. And unfortunately, he died on a plane crash with other 15 Americans and Ethiopians. They were on a mission to connect us to the outside world. And so I think it's important to connect with the outside world, but when you go there, you will experience by yourself what those refugees are going through. And you can be their voice to connect them to the outside world if they have no access to it. And so that's, I think, where education come in, and because education will enable you to communicate with others.
Kaylee, one of the other uplifting contributions came from David Beasley. He talked about programs where we see climate-forced migration, especially for internally displaced, that the World Food Program is using food for land programs to help rehabilitate land that is getting overused, that perhaps hasn't been adapted to changing climate conditions. And his argument is that you can not only provide for the humanitarian needs, but if you do it right, you can reinforce the land around it and actually repair some of the damage and perhaps increase resilience.
Now, what David Beasley is speaking to is this nexus between humanitarian intervention and development. And it's so important because one of the biggest proxies we have for vulnerability to climate change is poverty. And I think John Thon really talked about resilience and the need to be resilient. And I think part of that is having access to land, owning your own land, and being able to put inputs into it into the future. And so that's, I think, what David Beasley is really referencing to, and is quite important in the context of climate change, right? Because I've actually worked with a research group that shows that the more land you have, the more access to land you have, the more you're able to diversify what kind of agriculture you're doing. So it's very important for any sort of adaptation into the future.
It's interesting. I don't think that Americans realize in some places just how great the costs are to the host country for hosting displaced communities. So you have in Jordan roughly, 1/3 of the population are refugees. You have in Colombia 1.8 to 2 million Venezuelans. And these are costs. They're financial costs and there are other burdens on resources. And so oftentimes what they're looking for from us is just some help with some of those costs, because they're obviously the ones who are on the front line. So when I look at the human displacement challenge, what I was struck with, particularly in the work of the Wilson Quarterly, you have a topic which, if you're not careful, can be a topic that's pretty sobering, right? There's a lot of darkness to the human element, the challenge. On the other hand, we also have a number of leaders around the world who have embraced the challenge and found ways to help lift up. King Abdullah has talked about creating a thriving generation full of promise from the refugees, the young refugees that he has. President Duque, of course, not so long ago, created temporary protection status for more than 1 million Venezuelans to give them some sense of being out of the shadows and being into a framework. So we do see leaders around the world who are stepping up, recognizing the human element of the challenge and trying to make a difference. To each of you, what do you see around the world that gives you hope? What do you see as signs of important leadership at this moment? Kaylee, I'll begin with you.
Absolutely. Well, from the climate change perspective, I think what we really see is regional frameworks that are becoming much more and more important, and sub-regions that are leading the way. For instance, the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, has recently put together a protocol for freedom of movement. And freedom of movement is absolutely very important post-disaster, when you need to cross the border to seek safety and shelter. And what this protocol that's been put together does is allow people that were living within that sub-region to cross over contiguous borders to seek out that safety and shelter post-disaster, and allow them to stay there until they're back on their feet. And so that's super important within not just a disaster context, but a climate change context, because that will be a push factor more and more across borders.
John Thon?
More than 70 years ago, the world came together and set the Geneva Convention, 1951. Recently, that same body came up with the Global Compact on Refugees. A little bit different, but this is a non-binding framework calling for sharing of responsibility and burden across countries to manage forced displacement. And I think that was a hopeful sign if all the major powers are going to abide by that and try to, help host country, as you put it. Right now in the East African region, they host South Sudanese refugees, which is the largest forced displacement in Africa. If we don't help the host countries, they are just going to be tired. And one example is Kenya recently said it's going to return all the refugees to their countries when the push factors have not been addressed. And so I think burden and responsibility sharing is a good way forward to manage this situation. But I think the world can go a little further to address the root cause, especially the conflict part that force these people to leave because they want to go back to their home. And if that doesn't work, then helping her into the host countries and through resettlement and others, we can help the refugees.
Yeah, first of all, I'd emphasize that there has been a coming together of the international community, especially in the West, to provide for displaced people. Humanitarian aid has quadrupled in real terms in just the last 2 decades. And so, at least in the West, there is a continued real interest and focus on helping people who are displaced because of conflict or persecution. But I'd actually focus, what gives me real hope is actually at the individual level. As I think John Thon, a couple of us have touched on, the resilience at the individual level, I think, is very important for us to appreciate and understand. I certainly saw it among my former colleagues, my friends, and new friends in Albania. Refugees are not passive victims, right? They've been forced from their homes for calamitous reasons, but they're looking to start new lives. They're looking to recover and move forward. And I think you don't have to look too far, sitting right at this table. There are some really inspiring examples of people who've done that. I've known other Afghans previously who have come to America seeking asylum. And they're productive, inspiring examples of Americans today. And so that resilience, that integration, that personal quest to move forward as an individual and as a family unit, I find really inspiring every time I meet them.
So I'll close with this on my own account. We all see numbers all the time. We see numbers from around the world. We see the global numbers. And I think sometimes when people see those numbers, they step back, right? It's too much for them to process. But it is instead individual cases where people look humanity in the eye that we see humanity expressed. A few years ago, I went over the course of several days to both Burma and to Bangladesh in my capacity as USAID administrator. And one of my favorite people was a young Bangladeshi officer who was in charge of the crossing point, the command post. And he told a story of what it was like when the surge of Rohingya came over. And he said that he had just gotten to, he had been there just a few weeks, and he had no instructions from the Home Office as to what to do. And he said for a while he would get 2 and 3 people coming across the border, and people would go back and forth. And then one night he heard the screaming. He heard these noises, and he heard gunfire. And he looked over the border into Burma, and it was a wave of humanity. He said he had no instructions. Nobody had told him what to do. And so, here he was armed. Should he protect the border? Should he load his gun? And he said instead what happened is people came up from the village with water and helped those people. My hero, and I think a reason for hope for all of us. Thanks to all of you for being part of this program, but also for your contributions to the Wilson Quarterly. We hope this is just part of the discussion, and we hope that everyone will take a look at the global displacement crisis and realize it is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you.